But to get things started, I was just wondering, Gavin, you've also done a tremendous amount of research and provided a couple of publications as well. Would you like to just comment on both Richard and Hilary's presentation, please?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Michael. Well, I don't know how many of you have heard of us before now, but just to explain our role in things, we are partly a research organisation, partly a crisis management organisation, and partly an expertise projection organisation on behalf of professional service firms with whom we've been involved for the last 20 years or so. Just to introduce perhaps some of the materials on your seats, that first report was inspired by Louis Armstrong over here. So that first piece of research was really a scanning shot over the professions. It is flawed. We didn't consider the blood professions as fully as we might have done at the time, but we realized that the ear of government was best got by speaking to the money. So you'll see all sorts of statistics in that research which talk about the amount of employment in the professions as we understood it at that time, and the contribution to the balance of invisible earnings and so forth. So there's quite a lot in that already. And then more recently, and by the way, it's got a good track on what Sir Roderick was saying earlier in terms of the history and evolution of the professions, the route to regulated self-regulation, and really quite a lot of extra material. This one, just recently, is about contested elections within professional service firms, and having established how important it was as a sector, this is about how power is delegated in a certain range of partnerships, LLPs particularly, not all listed corporations within professional service firms, and that's an important distinction. But a look at how democratic systems are used to select leadership, which we think is quite an important reinforcing mechanism for professionalism, because it encourages power selection from people who are themselves empowered, and that builds a legitimacy in the leadership and management of these professional service firms. So I think it's quite important to note those two pieces of work. I was thinking in terms of my own personal experience, just bringing it back and building on what was said earlier. I think when we select professionals, we want to make sure they're relevant to our needs. If we've got a brain tumour, we probably want somebody of very high attainment. If it's a tax matter, certainly in my case, having the best in the land may not be the ultimate goal. We want somebody who's relevant. We want somebody, building on Richard's point, who is responsive, who is well managed, who can respond to our needs. We want people with up-to-date knowledge as well. We want people who are really interested in helping us. We want people who have a good chemistry with us. We probably do want to know how they earn their money, what their fee structure is. We want honesty, attainment, experience, empathy, clarity, courage of conviction, and pragmatism, I think. Those will be if I can have a slightly greedy take at a number of qualities that we would want to see in our professionals. But a lot of the debate here, and this is why they are quite large pieces of research, a lot of the debate is around a very nuanced set of phenomena. I think professions themselves are an artifact of history. Probably you can trace it back to Protestant thought, if you go far enough back and need to get back to the evidence of the Bible and so forth. They certainly existed within quite a strong spiritual dimension to begin with. Professional bodies are complex organisms. The realities they deal with are complex and nuanced, and I think part of our problem in relating to them or understanding them properly is that they're understood through binary systems of parliament, law, and the media, black and white, systems which don't actually allow for many tones of grey. One thing I definitely think is missing, or at least not as evident as it should be, is far more active campaigning professional bodies. I was speaking to one of our members at Professions for Good who contrasted the vigour of the debate in new countries such as India, really angsting about ethics and professions. It really matters over there as they go forward as a society and an economy. Whereas here, we're resting on pretty ancient laurels and I think still rank ethics as a kind of tick box that we put somewhere down the professional body's checklist. So I think far more active engagement, far more front of mind discussion of ethical matters. Just a couple of extra remarks, if I may, Michael. I think the whole debate about whistleblowers was instructive. I think possibly an honours system which is based at least upon an ethical set of achievements or attainment, I think that would be an extremely beneficial development in our public life. I think that's important, and I think that far from just knighting bankers who make a greater profit, and I'm not banker bashing, banks have an incredibly important role in our economy and society. But rather than those who risk the entire ranch in building the bank too quickly, those who have made a real contribution to the fabric of our life, economic elsewhere, there should be that recognition. And I think absolutely supporting whistleblowing in a sensitive manner, because you can't wade in with big boots, as Louis was saying, into complex and difficult situations. So I'd like to see our professional bodies, above all, standing up and being counted and engaging in the debate with presidents and chief executives particularly, making their voice heard. But to do so, they've got to put this right up their own personal agendas and start to lead from the front. And only then, I think, will they start to get the respect they perhaps merit from politicians and others.
Thank you, Gavin. Excellent. Well, folks, again, we turn to you. During the break, one of you came up to me and remarked that the professions that the previous panel most admired were those in life and death situations, which I thought was interesting because I pulled out an old joke. A lawyer and a physician had a dispute over precedence. They referred it to Diogenes, who decided in favor of the lawyer as follows: let the thief go first and the executioner follow. And so when Gavin is remarking about the blood professions, I got a bit terrified. Now, this session is about very much public interest communities or selfish cartels. So as Roderick, I think, opened, public interest or self-interest, what's going on here, and is it one or the other? I doubt it, but how do we keep them both in balance? Richard pointed out the importance of managing your firm well, otherwise you're not supporting your clients in the first place. But it's also very clear that we are quite suspicious about that. Ogden Nash said, professional men, they have no cares. Whatever happens, they get theirs. And so how do we keep this in balance? And so I'd like to turn over, if I could, to you, the audience, for comments and questions to a panel who I think represent a rich range of views on this subject. Hands up, those who'd like to kick in. Okay, there we go. We'll start here. There, great. Sorry, Lauren, just here.
Hello, my name's Sarah Brown. I was an accountant, I'm now a historian. So I'll take you back to the 1820s, 30s, when Lord Brougham had a concept that he thought that philanthropy could pay for education. And in order to get the money, he brought up the cases of abuses and horrendous cases. I am now working my way through the Royal Commission, and 99% of those endowments did what they meant to do and often exceeded what they were expected to do. So I think the human condition is that if they are looking after things, human beings tend to do them well. This is for professions and bodies and all the rest of it. Unfortunately, because he was a rather arrogant guy, the politicians didn't go with his idea. And although the first year they paid 30,000 as a grant into education, I might say at the same time they gave the king 70,000 to update the mews and the horse stables. But if you look at how much is paid on regulations of schools now, it might be that we overreact because of abuses when the majority of people, as Hilary said, are doing a good job. And regulation is the thing that people say, let's do that. And maybe you do it because of a small number and everybody else has to follow suit, and it costs the state or us, the taxpayers, a lot of money.
Ian Harris, again. I was thinking all the while, actually during both of the talks, to paraphrase your talk, Richard, you're really talking about, mostly talking about or analysing a disjoin between the professional's perception and the client's perception. That's one of the big challenges that you were talking about, and indeed within the firms, the disjoins. And that made me think about the size of the firms. And similarly, again, paraphrasing a lot of research, you're talking about the challenge of building trust. And again, I was thinking about the size of firms, and can you really trust something as big as a big firm? And then I suppose I was thinking about this in the context of cartels being part of the question for this for this panel, and I was thinking about all the talk with which, to a large extent, I agree about banks being too big to fail, and we need to do something about this. And I just wonder whether a lot of our professions in general, thinking about the big four in the accountancy profession, the magic circle, and the legal profession, you know, are our firms, professional firms now, you know, too big to be trusted, too big to actually understand the perceptions within their firms and the client perceptions. And if they are too big, so question, are they too big? And if they are too big, what can we do about it?
Thank you. And lady there on the side.
I'm Tanya Hayes, Head of Conduct and Compliance at AAT. If I could frame my question in the context of Sarah's question, and ask the panel, what role do you see the modern media playing in the public perception of the public interest and professionalism? Do you see it as driving it or representing it?
Well, for a second there, I thought we'd have some whistleblowing. Oh, well. Okay, panelists, a few questions to get your teeth into. So, media, size and trust, and really overreaction to regulation, I think. Sorry, overreactions that lead to regulatory intrusions out of proportion. Who'd like to kick off? Richard, do you?
Yeah, I can give us some thoughts. Have you come across what I call the laws of hostile journalism? The laws of hostile journalism. Is that a phrase anyone's heard? It's quite simple, really. 1 instance per million is a problem. 2 instances per million is a disaster. 3 instances per million is a conspiracy. And 6 parts per million is 6 sigma, which is the most reliable standard any manufacturing process aspires to. Yeah? So you're absolutely right. There is in my mind, a clear situation that, whether it's the 24/7 media, whatever it is, that there is an eagerness to print and perhaps do checking afterwards, what I call ready, fire, aim. Now, honourable exceptions notwithstanding. I think what is interesting, though, from your point, is that I call it the rogues. A lot of the problem that I think you have, particularly in the financial sector, is that there is a general impression that everybody was at it. That these massive bonuses, well, the average bonus was something like £500 for the average worker behind the counter in Lloyds Bank. Just lots of people work there, so the numbers got quite big. And I think the part of the problem has been that there has been a perceived failure to identify the people who are really at fault, and in an appropriate way to deal with them. And I think there's some research just come out I mentioned which actually shows, yes, there are ways that you can actually identify those patterns of behaviour. They're obviously associated with bullying, and that if that's the case, then probably the regulators will have some more effective tools to play with. So that I think there are some people who are trying to do something in that space. Staying with too big to fail, Ian's point, I mean, I think they're not called the final four for nothing, are they? I mean, that's what they're called, not the big four, the final four. The research, incidentally, wasn't size-specific, and it made no difference. We had very small firms contributing, we had about 400 or 500 firms, and very small ones and very large ones. It didn't seem to make a lot of difference. The key to it was more around trust and collaboration, and those who have worked in an organisation of 4 people, if they don't trust each other, it can be pretty horrific. And I know some of the very large firms where they've got the culture right can be amazing places to work. So we couldn't see anything in our statistics which suggested that the size of the firm made a huge difference, other than saying, I guess, as you would, obviously the management has to be more switched on and more focused when they've got that many more problems to deal with, and size, they do grow. So what role does the media play? Does it drive or does it represent? Or does it just comment? I tend to go with the third, to be honest. I'm not sure they always take the time to understand the issues.
Okay. Hilary, your thoughts?
I'm very happy to share some thoughts on the size point. I was asking myself about, am I personally, as a professional, a public interest community, or am I a selfish cartel? I decided rather than trying to look at it for everybody, I'd try and bring it down to one individual person and look back across my career and see what conclusions I could draw. And after I qualified as a chartered accountant, in fact before AAT existed, which is quite a confession to make, I became a partner in a small firm of chartered accountants. So at that point in my career, I was obviously involved in managing fees, managing client relationships, making sure the firm was profitable enough to succeed in the future. So that was, if you like, the first third of my career. The middle chunk of my career was around working for the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales. I went down there to seek their advice about setting up on my own. Heresy, I was about to leave a practice before I was the age of 60. Nobody had done it for 100 years, but there you are, somebody's got to start. But ended up working for ICAW as an advisor going around firms and accountants. And in doing that, I was actually selling my time, both one-off assignments and also repeat business. I then got even more commercial in my role at the Institute, in that I became the finance director of the commercial arm there, where the whole point of that function was to make money, to smooth us able to do more things in other areas. And then ultimately, when I was there, I was actually just involved in managing people. I was responsible for all the Institute member services. I then committed what I gather is a double sin, in that I took an MBA, which we weren't very happy about earlier on this afternoon, and I then became a lecturer at a university, so I now know I'm in another unregulated profession. But in doing that, that completely changed the sort of work I was doing. I was now a lecturer, a university lecturer, part-time. And the rest of my time, I was involved in becoming a trustee of pro bono organisations, or on a pro bono basis. So housing association, benevolent association, 2 accountancy bodies. And all across there, you'll see that I've made different choices, and at different times I've made more money, at different times I've made less money, different times I've been more aware of certain aspects of the work I was doing than others. But across them all, and this was the conclusion I reached, across them all there's been this golden thread of being a professional. And across them all, I think I've been perfectly consistent in the decisions I've made. And those decisions really are all based on the ethical code that I subscribe to. IFAC, which is the worldwide body for accountants, has got 180 bodies worldwide that are all involved in buying in and then implementing a professional code of ethics. They've got as characteristics integrity, objectivity, professional competence and due care, confidentiality, professional behaviour. And actually, as far as I'm concerned, whether I was doing more of my public interest work that I'm doing at the moment, or whether I was involved in my earlier roles where I was more concerned in making money for organisations, throughout that whole time, I actually bought into all those qualities. So for me, when we talk about the really, really big organisations, we have to remember they're made up of a whole load of individuals, and for each of those individuals, their professional reputation will be really, really important. And I think we need to recognise that and look at how the whole area can build together.
Okay. And Gavin, I suspect you have some thoughts on the media question.
Yes, thank you. I'll probably start with that. I think we have to remember that News International and MP's expenses were both broken by the media. So I think we need to celebrate the fact that we do have a free media, which is a pretty important guarantor of our freedoms and indeed a way of getting at the truth. So I think that in many respects the media does play a very helpful role in pointing out where we go wrong or particular transgressions. They use their limited privilege quite well on many occasions. Where I believe they begin to reflect as opposed to drive the agenda is when it'll get down to things like trade media, for instance, talking about PEP in law firms, which seems to be a contest between the top firms as to who's got the largest earnings. And I'm not sure that's a helpful direction or good direction of travel for us. Despite the fact we have represented many such firms, but we do so in projecting their expertise rather than that.
Gavin, for some folks, PEP.
But we do so by...
Sorry, PEP meaning?
PEP, sorry, thank you very much. Profits per equity partner. So, and that is very much a game initiated by the legal directories and then taken up with aplomb by legal weeklies in particular. So that seems to be a measure of professional success, whose firm can deliver the most partners with north of 750,000 per year PEP. So I think that's where our trade press in particular can merely reflect what is going on, which is not necessarily a helpful trend. So a couple of thoughts there. I think we have a wider problem with the press, but it reflects our own diminishing attention spans, I'm afraid, as well, in that they will tend to go to hyperbole, to polar opposites. They will tend to go for human interest, readily accessible, consumable stories, good stories, in inverted commas. We seem to be less interested in long chain thought, in deep debate, as a society as a whole. And so they reflect our diminishing attention spans and our need for entertainment as opposed to information. Coming back, I think, to too big to trust as professional service firms. Of course, there can be instances where the firms are too small to trust in really complex matters and big corporate transactions. You wouldn't want to entrust it to too small a firm. I would agree with my fellow speakers there. I think that as a firm grows, so you have to reinforce ethical behaviour by ever more explicit policies, by, if you like, better anecdotes, better heroes, better admonition as we go along. I think that there's a degree of formality in the communication that needs to kick in. So I think it's possibly more difficult with diverse, multinational professional service firms where you're catering to people with fundamentally different ways of coming at a similar problem, not better, not worse, just different. And I think that needs quite a lot of extra debate, discussion and explanation in order to make that work. And finally, about regulatory overreaction. I'm not a regulatory expert or a lawyer, but I do agree. I think it was true to say, and people in the room no doubt know better than I will on this, but I think for every day that New Labour was in office, they introduced a new law. And I'm not sure we're any more law-abiding as a result, or that we have controlled ourselves any better as a society in the face of that. I'd be interested to hear, but I think actually embedding control systems and delegating, devolving power out through responsible, peer-tested organisations to a degree, regulated self-regulation being perhaps a formula, is an efficient way of running a society, and running a trust-based society within embedded principles seems to me a lot more sensible than trying to cover off every eventuality through a regulation or a law.
Well, I might exercise a chairman's prerogative on this panel at this point, which is really, I'd like to be a little annoying and discomforting, if I may. We have things like the BMA, and according to the BMA, at least until recently, the only people who were more competent than God were doctors. It was God who made the mistakes. It was, as Michael alluded to, you know, a gentleman was hounded halfway around the world to Australia just to report on untoward deaths in Bristol. We've just had a huge financial crisis, which involves actuaries, accountancy technicians, ICAW, FCCAs, CFAs, wherever they are, and rating agencies, and on and on. I don't see anybody in the dock. So where is this ethics without some forms of sanctions? Or in the case of the financial crises, are we actually saying the professions are incompetent, but everybody within them is horrifically ethical, just unable to function? I mean, you know, what's going on here? You know, it's nice to talk about ethics, and it's a lovely thing, but Hilary, you said earlier that, for example, you know, when one profession is brought into disrepute, it sort of ricochets amongst the others. Is this preventing us? Are we too big to be honest?
I think it's, you raised some really good points. You're obviously very good at being an annoying person.
Oh, thanks. I learned from Michael.
I mean, certainly, I can only really talk for the accountancy profession, but within the accountancy profession, there are arrangements in place where if there are certain levels of misdemeanour, they're dealt with in different ways. So sometimes they're dealt with within professional bodies, and sometimes they're dealt with across the whole board of professional bodies. So there are processes in place that do address where there are issues. What's really interesting with any cases like that, though, is just how long it takes. So it's an incredibly long process. So I'm afraid by the time you get the verdict, the initial disquiet has sort of festered for a very long time. But I think that's just because due process has to be followed.
Mm-hmm. Well, Gavin, you said small firms. I mean, Bertie Madoff is a good example of a small single firm, but I don't recall his institute doing anything about him.
Well, you know, I mean, as a general policy, I can't comment on them particularly, but I'm a huge believer in law, and in English law in particular. And if somebody has committed a criminal offence, the law exists there to be prosecuted. And in the case of News International, if journalists had broken the law, then they will be prosecuted and they will be sanctioned. If it's an impropriety, if it's something we don't deem to be professional, then the sanctions ought to exist within the professional body to sanction the individuals concerned. I think the mechanisms exist. What I'm slightly more concerned about is the lack of rigour, if you like, within our society in order to pursue those who may have done wrong or who stepped onto the wrong side. So excluding people from professions who have definitely fallen on the wrong side of things, I think is a very important mechanism. Shame is a perfectly good but possibly underused mechanism for controlling behaviour.
I agree. I just sometimes wonder if we're so busy stripping knighthoods we don't worry about professionals. But Michael.
Yes, I think it's working. Thank you. Can I challenge you on, I don't think if you break the law you always get court. Jimmy Savile is a perfect example. You can break the law for quite a few decades and get away with it and do some things quite horrifically. So we have some problems there. But can I go back to the exam question? Quality is a public interest product or service. Yet, if you have quality, you actually create a barrier to entry in most industries and markets, which is how we get this perception of being a selfish cartel. That barrier to entry creates sometimes what is perceived or in reality a monopoly, especially if you think about big four audits of the FTSE 100. That doesn't tend to move in the direction of perfect competition, which Thatcherites had always marketed as. But isn't it that attraction for that monopoly and the power that goes with it, the real problem that we have to deal with, rather than just a selfish cartel?
Great. Any other questions or comments before oh, great. We'll take the lady here. Just, yeah.
Thanks. My name's Helen Gardner. I don't have an affiliation. Whistleblowing has been mentioned a few times this afternoon, and how whistleblowers should be protected. But what about when professionals are used against other professionals to prevent ethical behaviour? I'm thinking of gagging clauses being inserted into NHS contracts for medics.
Excellent. And the woman just to your right.
My name is Mercy Jo Singham. I'm a lay chair of statutory health regulatory profession. I just wanted to raise an issue that doesn't seem to have been raised by anybody else, and that's when I have hearings in front of me. One of the issues that we always look at is the reputation of the profession, and sometimes that can be outside, if somebody is in breach of what I would call good citizenship. For instance, if they've committed some sort of criminal offence or something, not in their job or not related to their job. For instance, you know, sort of they're paedophile, or if they're domestic violence, or if they've had issues around alcoholism, those sort of issues, and they might be carrying out their day-to-day tasks fine, but it's about the reputation of the profession. And you haven't actually talked about that in relation to professionalism.
Thank you. And just here in the middle, Lauren.
Thank you. My name is John Ainsworth. I was the Chief Executive of the Chartered Secretaries for, I think, 18 years before I retired. And I was in professional formation for, I think, 24 years altogether. Very interesting debate this afternoon. I'm not sure I've got a question, but I have got some answers. And some of those answers
That's good.
you may find strange. One of the problems that I perceived as an individual and very much involved in professional formation was, how do you actually distinguish those who wish to be a professional from those who merely want to get the qualification in order to earn a lot of money? It is to do with that professional formation, and we had a little debate earlier on about how do you tell whether somebody's actually going to be able to practice. Well, a good, well-organised professional will create the circumstances in whereby the examinations may be passed at university or through their own arrangements, and then there's a period in which the individual must prove that they can do the job. My particular organisation had a booklet even. You had to fill in, the employer had to fill it and certify that you completed all the tasks that we set you before we allow you to become a journeyman professional. So that was one issue. So I thought really perhaps there are ways of doing these things, and I know many of the other professions actually adopt them. The more recent issues, the more recent question we've had about the ultimate integrity within these professions. Once somebody's become a professional person, you have to make it such that they don't want to give it up. Now, all chartered bodies have their own regulatory arrangements, and as such you are in charge of the regulation of your profession. And you have semi-judicial process. Those processes can or can not be effectively used. one of the complaints that I had of my fellow professionals, so sometimes you can be an annoying professional, was particularly in the law and particularly in accountancy, they did not, the punishment didn't fit the crime, to quote our friends Gilbert and Sullivan, didn't appear to the public to fit the crime, and often it was reported through the press, because the press themselves, representing the people, didn't feel that there was sufficient punishment for the transgressions that had taken place. And the problem there lay in the whole notion of how do the professional bodies treat their own members. And I'm afraid we adopted, and I adopted, a very harsh process. If you were guilty, you were drummed out of the brownies. We even had the power of unlimited fine, and the maximum fine we ever imposed was £60,000, which in the day was quite a lot of money. And it was in restitution, not to the benefit of our coffers, sadly, but it was in restitution. So there are ways of dealing with these things that people can adopt. So I wouldn't... We're focusing on the professions as though they are a spent force. I do believe they have had in the past the structures which could be useful for the future, and indeed I do believe that they are still probably the greatest degree of integrity found anywhere throughout the whole world, and are turned to increasingly by those emerging nations who realise that actually employing KPMG is going to be better than not. So that's my comment. I'm sorry for stopping there.
Thank you, John. Okay, folks, so we've got quite a bit here. Cartels, whistleblowing, professions versus money. Some thoughts sort of in closing from each one of you. Maybe I'll take it in reverse order. Gavin?
Well, I could start perhaps with gagging clauses, professions being used one against the other. And I can think of another very good example. Years ago, I employed a young man who, funnily enough, both parents had been advised by two clients of ours, both that had family practices, and one of those family practices, in order to assert reasonable needs on behalf of the woman, had advised the client to re-roof shortly before the settlement was arrived at. Now, is that a professional thing to do? It's a tactic. It worked. That was a pretty bitter divorce. I saw the product, if you like, in employing that young man. So I think there are plenty of examples where one profession can be set against another. At one level, I think this is a hugely complex area. I don't think there's a simple answer to it. But I do think that the public good should be there, at least in the deliberations, and should restrain perhaps some of the more extreme tactics. And I think people do need to ask themselves what they're about fine, you respond to the needs of the immediate client, but then you have a different client, which is a longer-term public interest, which has to be balanced. But quite how we define what the boundaries of that particular debate are, I think we would need another 2 or 3 days of conference before we even began to approach defining those. So perhaps if I could start with that one, and then perhaps pass on, I can come back to other ones in due course, but may I just offer to pass on the other two, if I may, to my colleagues, and then I'll come back perhaps later on.
Hilary?
I think one of the really big issues around professions is about how well we attract the high quality people that we want to join them in the first place. It comes back to educating new people when they're coming into professions. And if you like, there's a barrier to entry there. I mean, Michael talks about barriers to entry for the bigger firms and so on, but actually there are barriers to entry all over professions in all sorts of ways. But the reasons why there are barriers to entry is that it's more than a job. It's more than being involved with a trade association. It's more to do with being, it's not quite vocational, but it's definitely around the area of a calling of some sort, in that you're trying to make a difference with what you're doing. So you need to attract the really good talent so that your profession continues to be successful in the future. You obviously need to discipline bad behaviour along the way, and we've talked about that. I think what we also need to do, I was very taken with your phrase about making it so that people don't want to give up membership, so it really matters to them, so they want to go on having this ongoing relationship with the organisation. And I think there's something there around the whole question of ongoing engagement with all the members of a body, whether they're working in the practising side or whether they've moved out to work for other people. But it's this engagement with professional bodies, with professionals. Obviously, continual professional development helps an awful lot in that area. It's all part of people keeping their skills up to date. And then just finally, when we talk about people that have got particular problems, maybe addictions of certain sorts, and what happens there, I think one of the other attributes that professional bodies tend to have is that quite often we have benevolent associations. I happen to be a trustee of the Chartered Accountants Benevolent Association. So I think as bodies, as professions, we have a community of all our membership. And I think as bodies, we also have a responsibility to look after the members of that community if they fall into hard times. Which isn't to say that we're in any way not supporting the public interest, but it's to do with recognising that we're all part of the ongoing community that is our particular profession.
Richard?
I think one of the things I kind of feel as a group of managing partners in lots of different countries is I'm reminded of a story, which was true story. And this was somebody in New York who wanted to instruct a UK lawyer. And he did his due diligence and he talked around and he was told by a number of his people, the person you want to talk to is John Smith. Name's not important. So he rings up John Smith, being very American. I can't do an American accent, so I won't try. And says, I hear you are the world's expert in this area and I need some really good people. To which the response was, well, I'm not that bad. And he said, oh, I'm sorry to have disturbed you, and put the phone down. I think we were our own worst enemies at times in terms of being self-critical. I mean, the profession's a fabulous success story. Largest, fastest growing, most successful sector in the country. The only one that's been putting on employment numbers in the last 5 years in the whole place, really, in any meaningful size. You don't get there through cartels. I mean, the stuff that law firms are restricted to do is about 2% of their revenue. 98% anybody could do. And the numbers can be challenged, but it's in that ballpark. What you've got, I think, today I'm hearing is almost a sort of, I call it a cultural dissonance. In other words, there is a set of rules and behaviours that professional people feel is the right thing to do, and there's the stuff that goes on everywhere else. And it's somehow, what you're then seeing as a result is there's a rather sort of a merger between what I loosely would call criminal behaviour in a particularly financial services context, and what we've been talking about today I call poor judgment. And a lot of time the media just kind of they made a mistake, therefore they're bad people. Do you know this story? You know, somebody makes a mistake, does that make them a bad person? Or did they just make a mistake? And a lot of people kind of jump from one to the other, I find. And I think probably the only answer is around transparency. We've talked about it today. In other words, the whole point about gagging clauses is it's the complete opposite of transparency. I suppose going back to basic psychology, to my mind, one of the best motivators is when people get embarrassed. Changes behaviour like you wouldn't believe. And your point about not wanting to drop out, that's not necessarily for them, it's for their neighbours and it's their friends and it's the whole society piece. It's my reputation at risk here. So I think it's really about, we're very self-critical, and I don't think we need to be. This is a success story for corporate UK. Believe me, in all sorts of ways. There's lots of dissonance, I think, between what we think is right and what the rest of the world now thinks is okay, morals, if you like. That the criminal behaviour, again, is merging with poor judgment, and there's a real lack of transparency. And that in itself is driving behaviours, because the more you get money into, I don't know, deep pocket, what are they called, deep pools, and people trading off limits. I mean, if somebody used to make them screwed up, excuse the French, in the old days, they went on the trading floor and you could kind of just look at them and say, yeah, he made a bad decision, he's suffering. Ever see the movie Trading Places? That's how it used to be. These days it's all on screens, nobody sees anything, and So I think, you know, if we can do something, it's just saying what level of transparency is associated with this report that we put out as a professional person. Who's seen it internally? Who's seen it externally? Let's share that knowledge. And I think that will solve half the problems.
Well, I can see that our panel is really getting heated up. Unfortunately, time is coming. The idea here of public interest versus selfish cartels, I was quite struck, Gavin, by your point about kind of two clients, the client and the public interest client as sort of an abstract client, although I'm always reminded of, you know, a man with one watch knows the time, a man with two watches is never sure. But I think there's something in that, actually, which is a good point. I just wanted to end this on another awkward, I won't say annoying, that seems to be the adjective today, an awkward question. And it really has to do with certainly my experiences. I won't name them, but I do know of two medical institutes in this country who have been horrifically successful at restricting their growth so that the returns to their members have grown quite significantly over the last 30 years. But I also am reminded of the Institute of Physics, just to pick on somebody completely different. The Institute of Physics about 8 or 9 years ago was running a lovely course, which was basically, you've become a physicist, but there are no jobs. And then they would run these courses to try and entice people, who paid, by the way, for the courses, their members to go and find jobs in the city. But there were about 30 jobs in the city for those sorts of physicists. We'd already done surveys on that, and they had about 300 people attending these courses in desperation to try and find work. So this, I think, is one of the big tensions. So the question to you three, and you can obviously tack on a closing statement too, quickly, but is it ethical for an institute to encourage entrance if there are no jobs? And in your case, Richard, maybe think about training contracts. Is it ethical for a firm to entice entrance in if there are no jobs? And I'll take it in forward order if I can. Richard, you first, perhaps?
Well, training contracts are quite easy because if you look at the accountancy profession, probably 95% of those who join will never make it to partner, and that's expected, and nobody has a problem with it, because most people who have an accountancy qualification do not work in the professions and never did. So the question to them is it a sensible use of our resources to run a very expensive training school for a bunch of kids who aren't going to stay with us much beyond 2 years post-qualification, if at all? I think that's a bit different than the physics one you arranged, where you possibly would be encouraging people to go for something where there is no marketplace. Yeah, I mean, again, I would be in probably of the view that would, assuming they had the knowledge, would be an inappropriate way for a professional body to behave, but I might be in the minority there.
If I can talk about the two bodies I'm involved with, AAT and ICAW. If I take AAT first of all, accounting technicians, globally, the world needs millions of accounting technicians. So actually, I don't think we've got a problem with the number that we train. They can find jobs. I mean, it's just a wonderful opportunity. As far as the ICAW is concerned, I believe it's something like 85% of the people that start training for the ICAW qualification actually qualify at the end. So as a body, ICAW actually believes very much in trying to manage the supply and demand and not raise expectations inappropriately along the way. And I think part of that is to do with, if you are involved in training for a profession where you've actually got the learning on the job, then that's actually part of the whole process. And I think as you're going through that whole process, then it's right that you should have an opportunity to reach a destination at the end.
Well, in direct answer to your question, I think, Michael, it may be worth becoming a physicist and not having a job as a physicist, so long as you can get some other job which is much better by dint of your having that training and that formation. But I think there's a wider question implicit in this, and it is that I think everybody responds to incentives. And in our first research there, we draw the example of I think it was from Freakonomics, estate agents who managed to hold out for much larger prices in their own real estate than that which they achieved for their clients. Surprise, surprise. So this applies to professions, and I think it also can apply to professional bodies. And I think professional bodies have a difficult task. They've got to keep the membership income going. They've got to derive income from publishing and ancillary activities, but they are not, I think they have to be careful to keep in balance their own direction as a body and make sure that they're genuinely serving members as opposed to becoming a creature of themselves. So I think they have to watch that particular moral hazard themselves, otherwise they can be miscued by having the wrong incentives again.
Well, thank you. I'd like to take just a couple of minutes before we thank the panelists just to kind of close down and summarize the day if I can. I really, the problem with being the tail gunner on an event like this is anything that you prepare in advance has already been shot. And fortunately, as I went through my notes, I was at least left with one joke and a book, neither of which have been mentioned. So what I'd like to do, just in closing, is to talk about three things: courtesy, community, and economy. In fact, as you'd probably gather, the joke that I expected somebody to use is probably one of the most famous lawyer jokes of all: professional courtesy. You know, a lawyer falls into shark-infested waters but isn't harmed because the sharks avoid him. And when he surfaces, people say, well, how did you get through those sharks? He says, professional courtesy. Oddly, it turns out that joke's Barry Poppick did a lot of research onto it. He traces it back to 1873. In the New York Commercial Advertiser, they had gossip of the day. With a total lack of professional courtesy, some Sherburne County, Minnesota wolves chased a couple of lawyers 5 miles. So it's possibly actually a true story. So courtesy, anyway, wasn't used. Thank you, panelists, for giving me my little slot there. The second thing, though, that I wanted to talk about was community. I was really pleased Hillary brought in community there in this second panel. And the reason for that is if you dig into, as Richard Chaplin was saying, definitions are important. The interesting thing for me is always, what is a profession, to profess? And it really goes back to the 1500s, and it was a specific sense, really. It means to profess means to openly declare something, but also having taken vows of a religious order. In other words, you'd made a vow to join a community. And what are the characteristics of a community in the abstract? I've written on this, as has Ian Harris, but we've boiled these things down to about 6, and I think you'll hear in each one of those 6 something virtually identical to what Richard put up and as the characteristics of a profession, as Michael. A common history and purpose, shared knowledge and culture, common practices, co-location in space and time, i.e. that people are interacting with one another, common action, that they lobby as a group for their own interest, and a co-created future. They have a vision of the future and how their role in working today is helping to achieve that. So what we're looking at here, these sort of self-organizing communities of self-employed experts, which goes back to the old guilds and goes back to the situations that I think certainly existed possibly up to about the Great War. And I think this is where I personally have some tensions today, where I wonder if the structures that we have today are not aligned with the sorts of structures that made the profession successful. I am a big fan of professions. But George Bernard Shaw wasn't. He said all professions are conspiracies against the laity. And I think this is the interesting bit on the economy that I find troublesome. And so what I was going to say was the book. Well, the book that nobody mentioned, or if they did, I missed it, was written by Harold Perkin back in 1989. It's called The Rise of Professional Society, England since 1880. And Perkin has a very interesting take on English history. He sort of says, look at the structure. We've moved from a class-based structure to professional-based structure. That's the basic theme of the book. And I have a few quotes here I'd just like to read out that might generate some thoughts. The entrepreneurial ideal was based on capital as the engine of the economy, setting in motion the production of goods and services, but the professional ideal was based on trained expertise, selection by merit. So the ideal citizen of the entrepreneurial ideal is a self-made man, an entrepreneur who is successful through his own unaided efforts. But in the professional society, it's slightly different. The ideal citizen was also a self-made man of sorts, who'd risen by native ability, with a little help from his educational institutions, to mastery of a skilled service vital to his fellow citizens. So slightly different take, but not too far off. But the crucial difference that Perkin points out is the entrepreneur proved himself by competition in the market, the professional by persuading the rest of society and ultimately the state that his service was vitally important and therefore worthy of guaranteed reward, which leads on to the entrepreneurial ideal calls for as little state interference as possible, but the professional looked to the state as the ultimate guarantor of professional status, and therefore this professional power becomes based on the strategy of occupational closure. And he concludes that since most professions' expertise does not enjoy a natural scarcity, its value has to be protected and raised first by persuading the public of the vital importance of the service, and then by controlling the market for it. So we see this tension here, as one historian is almost reading history, as this tension between the self-interest of the cartels or the self-interest of the invisible hand. And as Roderick, I think, pointed out at the very beginning, it is somewhat paradoxical that we say on the one hand self-interest is a great thing, it makes the economy function, and on the other that self-interest is impossible to achieve, and therefore we have a regulatory-based culture that tries to interfere. I wanted to end on one other little quote, but before I do so, I just want to recap briefly. Roderick, I think, was excellent in looking at the regard and loss of trust, and really were we using the wrong model of human behavior, the selfish interest model. Michael on trusting to do the right thing for other individuals and being annoying, which I think we'll all go away with remembering that. Richard on learning how to use this to manage groups and align client interests with the firms, and Hilary on trust. I personally am beginning to wonder if large organizations are incompatible with professionalism, but that's my personal take on it. But I thought I'd conclude with two quotes, really. One, a slightly long one from Marshall McLuhan. He says, "Professionalism is environmental. Amateurism is anti-environmental," contrasting professionals and amateurs. "Professionalism merges the individual into patterns of the total environment. Amateurism seeks the development of the total awareness of the individual and the critical awareness of the ground rules of society. The amateur can afford to lose. The professional is the expert, the man who stays put." And I don't think that's something we've talked about today much, and in another session. It's the commitment that professionals have to put in that makes them special. But all that said, I'm trying to remember, I think it was John in the break was muttering, I think quite rightly, we seem to be compartmentalizing professionals and more professionals, and institute of professionals, etc. But for those of you who are not professionals, I thought I'd end on a great note. Just as the meek shall inherit the earth, Marcel Mauss, a Canadian politician, said, "The more the world is specialized, the more it will be run by generalists. So you shall rise." Anyway, it's been a wonderful session. We've had two great panelists and four great speakers. Would you please join with me in thanking this panel for their immense contribution today? Thank you.